In the summer of 1847, on a cotton plantation outside of Natchez, Mississippi, there lived a man whose name had been stripped from him the way bark is stripped from a sapling, forcibly and early. The white men called him Moses, though not for any biblical reverence. They called him Moses because on his third day on the Hargrove plantation, he had led a group of field hands through a flooded creek crossing without losing a single person, navigating by instinct and memory in the kind of darkness that swallows men whole. Overseer Briggs had laughed and said, "Well, look at that, Moses parting the waters." And the name had stuck the way mud sticks to boots. Moses was 31 years old, lean as a heron, with eyes the color of river clay, and the kind of stillness about him that made animals trust him and men uneasy. He had been born on a Virginia tobacco plantation, sold at 14, sold again at 22, and arrived at the Hargrove estate 4 years prior as part of a transaction that also included 2 mules and a cotton press. He had long since stopped flinching at the mathematics of his own life. What made Moses different from the other men and women in the quarters was not his strength, though he was strong, nor his intelligence, though everyone knew he was the sharpest mind on the property. What set Moses apart was his patience. He had the patience of stone. He had watched and listened for 4 years, the way a man studies a river before crossing it, and he had come to a conclusion that most men would have dismissed as madness. He was going to destroy this plantation, not with fire, not with poison, not with flight, but with the rules themselves. The Hargrove plantation operated under what Master Edmund Hargrove fancied a highly organized system. Edmund was a second-generation planter, educated in Charleston, and he prided himself on running his operation with the rigor of a business rather than the brutality of a frontier camp. He had written down his rules. This was the thing that Moses had understood within his first month. Edmund Hargrove had written everything down. The rules of the Hargrove plantation, as posted on a board outside the overseer's office, were as follows. All bondsmen shall complete their assigned task before undertaking any other labor. No bondsman shall work on tasks not assigned to their station without written authorization. All disputes of work quality shall be adjudicated by the master himself, or in his absence, the head overseer. All tools issued to bondsmen remain the property of the estate, and shall be returned in the condition they were received. Any bondsman who believes himself wrongly punished may appeal to the master within 1 day of the offense. Work shall begin at first light and conclude at dusk, with 1 hour afforded at midday for rest and sustenance. There were 23 rules in total. Edmund had added them over the years, each one a response to some perceived disorder, some gap in efficiency. He was proud of them. He showed visiting planters these rules as evidence of his modernity, his enlightened management. Moses had memorized all 23 rules on his first week. He had spent the next 4 years figuring out exactly what they meant. It began on a Tuesday in June with the cotton weevil. The task system at Hargrove was simple. Each field hand was assigned a row count per day. Moses' assignment was 40 rows. He had for 4 years completed 40 rows every single day, never more, never fewer, with the steadiness of a clock. Briggs had often pointed to him as an example of reliable output, which was the closest thing to a compliment the overseer extended. That Tuesday morning, Moses reached his 40th row at approximately 2 in the afternoon. He stopped. He laid down his hoe. He sat at the end of the row and waited. Briggs rode over on his grey horse within minutes. "What in the hell are you doing, boy?" "I finished my task," Moses said, keeping his eyes respectfully down, his voice even. "Rule number 1 says I shall complete my assigned task before undertaking any other labor. My assigned task is 40 rows. I've done 40 rows." Briggs stared at him. "Get back to work. You'll do 50 rows today." "I'd need written authorization for that, sir," Moses said with absolute calm. Rule number 2. I can't work on tasks not assigned to my station without written authorization from Mr. Hargrove or yourself. Briggs opened his mouth and closed it. He had, in fact, written rule number 2 himself, after an incident 3 seasons ago when a bondsman had spent 2 days building a fence that was supposed to have been built on the other side of the property. Briggs had been furious at the lost productivity and had demanded something be done about unauthorized work assignments. He had not expected the rule to be turned on him. "I'm authorizing it right now," Briggs said, verbally. "The rule says written authorization, sir," Moses said. He looked up just briefly, and his expression was utterly sincere. "I don't make the rules." Briggs grabbed his horse's reins so tightly the animal tossed its head. He rode back to the overseer's office, scrawled something on a piece of paper, rode back and shoved it at Moses. Moses read it carefully, nodded, and picked up his hoe. He worked until dusk, then stopped precisely when the light failed, as the rules specified. He had planted 1 seed. Over the following weeks, Moses did not push hard. He was patient. He had learned that the most dangerous thing a man could do was move too fast and alert the system to what he was doing. So he waited, watched, and then began, methodically, to use every rule available to him. Rule 3. Disputes of work quality. Moses began requesting quality adjudications, not constantly, that would be transparent, but regularly. If a row was not straight enough according to the planting specifications Hargrove had himself written, Moses would stop and formally request an inspection. This required Briggs to send word to the main house for Hargrove to come out, or for the head overseer to be summoned from wherever he was managing the other fields. Each adjudication took between 20 minutes and an hour. What made it impossible to punish was that Moses was right every time. He had studied the planting specifications as carefully as he had studied the rules. He never requested an adjudication he couldn't win. The rows he flagged were genuinely substandard, not by much, but enough. When Hargrove would come out, red-faced and impatient, he would look at the row, look at the specification book he himself had written, and have to concede that Moses was correct. "The man is following the rules," Hargrove would say to Briggs, who would nod tightly and say nothing. Rule 6. Tool return. Every evening, Moses returned his tools in spotless condition. This was itself unusual. Most hands returned tools dirty, and there was a boy in the equipment shed who spent mornings cleaning them. Moses returned his tools clean, inspected, and accompanied by a brief verbal accounting. Hoe number 7, received in condition fair, returned in condition good, condition improved. After 2 weeks of this, Moses gently mentioned to Briggs that the specification of returning tools in the condition they were received was being violated by most of the other hands, which was technically true. He was not being malicious, he explained. He simply wanted to make sure he wasn't in violation himself and wanted to clarify the standard. Briggs now had to enforce the tool cleaning rule on everyone, which added an extra 20 minutes to every evening's close and created considerable resentment. Not toward Moses, because Moses had been careful not to make it seem like a complaint, but toward Briggs, who appeared to have suddenly invented a new end-of-day chore. Rule 12, the Tarso, midday hour. The rule stated that 1 hour would be afforded at midday for rest and sustenance. Moses took exactly 1 hour, not 55 minutes, 1 hour. He ate slowly, rested properly, and returned to the field when the hour was complete. This was subversive in a way that took Briggs weeks to fully understand. The other hands, by habit and fear, took approximately 40 minutes at midday, returning early to avoid any accusation of laziness. Moses, by taking his full hour, began to make the others aware that they had been giving away 20 minutes a day that belonged to them. Quietly, without any speech or organization, other workers began to linger a few minutes longer at midday. Briggs couldn't punish them. It was the rule. It was Hargrove's wife, Catherine, who first told Edmund that something was happening that he didn't fully understand. Catherine was a sharp woman who had no illusions about the nature of the estate, and she had been watching Moses with the attention of someone who recognizes a chess player when she sees one. "Edmund," she said over supper one evening, "that man Moses is going to cost you this season if you don't figure out what he's doing." "He's following the rules," Edmund said, and even as he said it, he heard the absurdity of it. "I can't very well punish a man for following the rules." "That's precisely his point," Catherine said. Edmund called Moses to the main house the next morning. Moses came with his hat in his hands, his posture respectful, his eyes doing that thing where they were down but somehow still watching everything. "I want to talk to you about your conduct," Edmund said. "Of course, sir," Moses said. "And I want to mention that I may need to invoke Rule 19. Edmund paused. "What?" "Rule 19, sir. Any bondsman who believes himself wrongly punished may appeal to the master within 1 day of the offense. I'd like to note that I haven't been punished yet, and I don't believe I've done anything wrong. I've followed every rule to the letter. But if this conversation is leading toward a punishment, I want to note my intention to appeal." The room was very quiet. Edmund stared at the man standing before him. Moses looked back, not defiantly, not with any particular expression at all. He was, as far as Edmund could tell, completely sincere. He was invoking a rule that Edmund himself had written after a visiting abolitionist pamphlet had shamed him into something that felt like fairness, but was really just paperwork. "I'm not punishing you," Edmund said carefully. "I'm glad to hear it, sir," Moses said. "Then we're just talking." "We're talking," Edmund confirmed. He felt, for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate, that he was losing. "Then I'd like to respectfully bring up something I noticed in the specification ledger," Moses said. "The cotton yield targets were set in 1839, sir, according to the record. I've been keeping notes. It's not against any rule to keep notes. And I believe the soil in the eastern field has declined in quality since then. The targets may need to be revised downward, which would technically mean we've all been working above our required output without proper compensation in kind, which Rule 8 covers, sir, regarding additional labor and its recompense." Edmund Hargrove was a man who understood business, and what he was hearing, translated from the careful language of a man watching every word, was this: "You built a machine. I learned how the machine works. Now I'm running it." Moses had not done this alone. He had been careful about that too. Any one man doing these things could be sold, moved, disappeared into the chain of transactions that was the brutal liquidity of the slave economy. What Moses had done over 4 patient years was teach. He had not taught in meetings. He had not organized in any way that could be seen or named. He had taught the way water teaches stone, slowly through repetition, through proximity. A word here, an observation there. Did you know the rule says you get an hour? Or, if they give you a new task, you can ask for it in writing. He had focused on the women first, specifically the house servants, who had different rules, unwritten ones largely, but who had access to the master's house, to his correspondence, to the documents that listed what the law of the state of Mississippi actually said about the treatment of enslaved people. The law was deeply, grotesquely inadequate, but it existed. It had words, and Moses had discovered, through a house servant named Violet, who could read and was careful not to let anyone know she could, that some of those words could be useful. Violet was 24, quiet, and possessed of the same quality Moses had, a kind of deep stillness that people mistook for simplicity. She had been reading Hargrove's mail for 3 years, not the personal letters which were of no use, the business, correspondence, the documents from his lawyer, the pamphlets from the State Agricultural Commission, and she had found several things that Moses had been waiting to hear. First, there was an ongoing legal dispute about the property line on the western edge of the plantation. This was relevant because it involved an ongoing survey, and surveyors, outside men, neutral men, men with notebooks, were going to be coming onto the property. Second, Hargrove had taken a loan from a bank in New Orleans. The terms of the loan had a clause about maintaining the productive capacity of the plantation. If output dropped significantly, the bank had the right to send an auditor. Third, there was a new anti-slavery newspaper being distributed in Natchez, reaching even some of the white townspeople, and it had been publishing letters from formerly enslaved people who had escaped to the north. The letters described conditions, named names, named plantations. Moses sat with this information for 3 weeks before he decided how to use it. When the surveyor came in late August, he was a young man from Philadelphia named Garrett, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a tendency to write everything in small, neat handwriting in a leather-bound journal. He was not an abolitionist, not exactly, but he was from the North, and he had been to college, and there was something about the man that suggested he was capable of being troubled by things that troubled him. Moses was assigned to assist the surveyor team in carrying equipment. This was standard. Surveyors needed guides and labor, and Moses was the most reliable man on the property. Hargrove had organized this himself. Over 3 days in the western fields, Moses spoke to Garrett carefully and indirectly, the way you speak through a window rather than a door. He did not ask for help. He did not describe suffering in dramatic terms. What he did was answer the surveyor's questions completely, accurately, and in such a way that the man with the notebook could not help but write down what he heard. "How long have you been on this property?" Garrett asked, making conversation while his assistant took measurements. 4 years, Moses said. "And before that?" "Virginia, then South Carolina." He paused. "I've been transported 3 times in my life. I know this land from Virginia down through here pretty well." Garrett wrote something. Moses could not see what. "The system seems organized here. Garrett said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has been told to keep his political opinions to himself on work trips. Mr. Hargrove believes in rules, Moses said. I believe in them too. He said it simply, with no irony that Garrett could have named or quoted. Garrett looked at him for a moment. What do you mean by that? I mean that rules are interesting things, Moses said. They mean what they say generally. If a rule says a man gets an hour at midday, he gets an hour at midday. If a rule says disputes can be appealed, they can be appealed. The interesting thing about rules is that they work the same way, no matter who's using them. Garrett wrote in his notebook, for a long time after that, Moses went back to carrying equipment. By September, the numbers were visible to anyone keeping the ledger. Output on the Hargrove plantation was down 14% from the previous year. Not dramatically, not enough to suggest sabotage, not enough to result in the brutal crackdowns that had broken other forms of resistance on other plantations. Just enough to hurt. Just enough to push the quarterly figures below the threshold that would attract the bank's attention. Briggs knew something was wrong and couldn't say exactly what. He couldn't point to a single violation. Every worker, when questioned, could cite the rule they were following. The tool return process was taking time. The quality adjudications were taking time. The midday hour was being taken when he assigned additional tasks without written authorization. The workers, politely, consistently, asked for the paperwork, which created delays. When he tried to enforce earlier starts, Moses was there to note that the rule said first light, and first light was a natural condition that varied by season, and perhaps the master could clarify the exact minute. When Briggs lost his temper and struck two workers, something that had always been within his authority and had never been questioned, Moses filed appeals on their behalf within the day, not dramatically, not with speeches. He walked up to the main house, knocked on the appropriate door, and said respectfully that Rules 19 and 20 covered this situation, and he wanted to make sure the process was being followed properly. Edmund Hargrove sat in his study that evening and looked at his own rule book for a long time. His wife sat across from him. You made a system, Catherine said, and the system works. It works against me. Does it? She said. Or does it just work? He didn't answer. The man hasn't broken a single rule, she continued. He hasn't run. He hasn't organized, not in any way you could prove or punish. He hasn't stolen, hasn't lied, hasn't done anything you could take him to town for. He has read the rules you wrote, and he has followed them. Edmund turned a page in the rule book. Rule 14 stared back at him. All bondsmen shall be treated with sufficient regard for their capacity for labor, as damage to a bondsman's health is damage to the estate's productive capacity. He had written that one after a brutal winter in which 2 field hands had died of exposure, and he'd had to replace them at enormous cost. He had written it out of economics, not conscience. The rules I wrote, he said. Yes, Catherine said. The rules you wrote to manage a human being as if he were an inventory item. He's using them to point out the contradiction. You can't manage a human being like inventory, Edmund. They notice the rules. They remember them. They think. Here is what Moses had never planned. Freedom, in the immediate sense. He was not an escape plan. He was not an armed rebellion. He was not a martyrdom. What Moses had decided 4 years ago in the first weeks on the Hargrove estate was this. He was going to make the lie of the system visible, not to white men in newspapers, not to God, to the men and women around him. He was going to show them that the rules that had been used to justify every horror, to paper over every brutality with legality, were also available to them. That the language of order, of civilization, of property and rights, and documented process could be picked up by any set of hands. The rules didn't care whose hands held them. He had also decided something quieter and harder to articulate. He was going to make the men and women around him understand that they were not the problem. The system had spent generations telling them that their condition was a reflection of their nature, that they were suited to this, born for this, incapable of the kind of thinking that constituted full humanity. Moses had watched that lie sink into people the way cold sinks into the body on a winter night, slowly, without drama, until men stopped noticing it was there. Every time a worker successfully invoked a rule, something happened in their face. Moses had watched it happen again and again. A small, quiet recalibration, the understanding that the rule had worked, that they had used it, that it had worked for them the same way it worked for anyone. That was the thing Moses was actually building. In October, Violet found something significant in Hargrove's correspondence. A letter from his lawyer in Natchez discussing a new clause in an updated loan agreement. The bank, concerned about productivity metrics on several plantation accounts, was sending an auditor in November. Moses sat with this for a week. Then he did something that required him to call on every reserve of composure he had. He requested a meeting with Edmund Hargrove, formally, through the appropriate channel, which was a written request submitted to the main house, which was itself one of the rules. Rule 22, which stated that any bondsman wishing to bring a matter of business importance to the master's attention could submit a written request for a meeting. Nobody had ever used Rule 22 before. Not once. Hargrove stared at the written request for a long time before he agreed to the meeting. Moses came to the study and stood before the desk where Hargrove sat, and he said, "I understand an auditor is coming in November, sir. I'd like to discuss productivity." Hargrove said nothing. "I've been keeping notes," Moses continued. "As I mentioned before, it's not against any rule. The productivity decline in the eastern field is attributable to soil quality, not to labor output. I've documented this over the past 2 seasons. If the auditor needs someone who can speak to field conditions, I can do that." It was an offer, an extraordinary, unprecedented, baffling offer. "You're offering to help me with the auditor," Hargrove said. "I'm offering to tell the truth about the soil quality, sir," Moses said. "That's all. The truth about the soil quality happens to be useful to you. The truth about other things might not be. I'd leave it to the auditor to decide what questions to ask." The silence was enormous. What Moses was saying beneath the words was as clear as he could make it without saying it directly. "I know things about this plantation that could interest an auditor beyond just the soil. I am choosing right now to offer you something instead of something else. This is a negotiation." Edmund Hargrove was not a stupid man. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation he had been taught was stone, and was only now understanding was sand. He looked at Moses, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time, and he saw a man. Not the first time he had seen it, but the first time he had let himself fully register it. "What do you want?" Hargrove asked. His voice was different, the voice you use with someone you're negotiating with. "I want what the rules say I'm owed," Moses said. I want the hour at midday. I want my appeals heard. I want the tools issued in good condition and the tasks assigned in writing. I want the other hands treated according to the rules you wrote. That's all. That's all I'm asking for today, sir, Moses said, which was the most dangerous sentence he had spoken in 4 years, and both men in the room knew exactly what it meant. History is complicated and rarely arrives in clean conclusions. Edmund Hargrove did not, in November of 1847, free his enslaved workers. He was not transformed overnight into a righteous man. The auditor came, the soil quality documentation was presented, and the loan terms were renegotiated. Productivity on the plantation stabilized, partly because Hargrove, quietly, began actually enforcing his own rules in both directions, which meant the workers received what the rules said they were owed, and Briggs, who had been the gap between the rules and the reality, was dismissed the following spring. What changed was less dramatic and more durable. The men and women on the Hargrove estate knew what they had done. They knew they had done it themselves with their own minds through careful observation and patience and collective action so quiet it didn't look like action at all. That knowledge did not leave them. It traveled, in the way that knowledge travels on plantations, in whispers at the creek, and signals in the quarters, and messages carried in baskets and borrowed time, to other estates, other counties, other lives. Moses was never punished for any of it. There was nothing to punish him for. He had broken nothing. He had stolen nothing. He had run nowhere. He had simply read the rules and followed them, and in doing so had revealed the truth that systems built on injustice have always feared most, that the language of law and order does not belong to the powerful. It belongs to whoever takes the time to learn it.